Wednesday, August 19th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are Missouri School of Journalism colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, emotions are running high 10 years after Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans. So what was a Chicago Tribune columnist thinking when she wrote that she prayed for a Katrina to hit that city so it could hit the reset button? We'll talk about how Pro-Publica and the New York Times worked together to determine a special relationship that exists between communications giant AT&T and the NSA. And can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? Viewers are going to have to take a bit of a detour, first stopping by HBO before finding it on PBS. All puns aside, we'll talk about what this change signals about the program's mission. There's lots more on my list that I'm hoping we're going to get to before our half hour is up today, but let's start with a story that broke pretty early yesterday morning, a blending, if you will, between the old media and the new. NBC Universal put up $200 million investing in BuzzFeed. According to founder Jonah Peretti, BuzzFeed will use the money to extend its reach to TV and film. My first thought as I read about this was, okay, NBC is looking for a way to reach a millennial audience, the folks who are already on BuzzFeed reading those listicles or looking at cute memes of cats. It's a way to extend into that audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson is fairly simple. Success breeds success. BuzzFeed's been doing really well lately, and these legacy media want to associate with a brand that appeals to a younger demographic. I mean, the only thing to me is whether or not that deal is actually going to mean anything in terms of news for the audience. Are they just going to get more of those listicles? Like today, the 27 most outrageous things that have ever happened is one of their headlines. Or are they going to get more serious journalism? Because BuzzFeed is arguably trying to do more of that.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where you have, as Mike alluded to, the legacy media are they see an opportunity and they're going after it. And this has happened all across media, is where the large companies say, wait a minute, here's something, here's an opportunity, I can go and grab this, reach this audience. I may not want to change it right now. I may want to add to it, but as long as I have it in my my portfolio, then that gives me an entree into that particular audience.
And we're also seeing that as we see NBC form this partnership with BuzzFeed and having that outlet for it. We see that ABC has its division Fusion, which is targeting that millennial audience. And Fusion announces this week, too, that it's creating a unit specifically to do virtual reality storytelling. Now, in the name of full disclosure, one of our RJI fellows who was here last school year did a virtual reality depiction of what went on in Ferguson called Ferguson Firsthand. I worked with him very closely on that. Mike, you did as well. But virtual reality taking place at Fusion, drawing people in using that type of storytelling method.
And, you know, everybody is trying to get into virtual reality in one way or another. I mean, you mentioned that experiment. I mean, we also are working this semester with the Associated Press, which wants to figure out how to do virtual reality storytelling. And you can name a lot of other news organizations, the New York Times and a bunch of other folks that are trying to do this, because theoretically, virtual reality journalism is a way to really immerse people in a story in ways that we've never been able to done before. I say theoretically because there are a heck of a lot of hurdles to get over before we're at that point.
Some of those being, and I know these were some of the things we ran into working on Ferguson Firsthand, how do you make sure that you are actually creating an accurate depiction of what went on there, even considering exact distances of where certain buildings sat or cars or people in the Canfield Green apartments? How do you make sure you really pinpoint that virtual reality?
I mean, I think it has the potential to bring the audience into what's happening there in the moment. But as we talk about a lot on this show, where's the context there? If that's the only thing that the audience is going to get and they don't get, how did we wind up at this point? What are some of the systemic issues that led to this particular thing happening? If those aren't a part of it or a part of the overall story, then something's missing there. It has the potential to become an arcade. And that's one of the things that I think we need to be careful of.
And I think there are two different kinds of virtual reality journalism, at least, that we are talking about. I mean, there's one where journalists are actually on the scene of an event, capturing the content so that they can put together as realistic a representation as they can of what happened. And then there's something like the project you mentioned that Dan Archer worked on, where basically they took other people's recollections and tried to come up with their best reconstruction of what occurred. And I think those reconstructed stories, pose a lot more ethical challenges, because no matter how hard the journalist tries to get it right, they're relying on other people's reflections. And the problem with that is that visual sense that you get from being in a 3D world just overwhelms your skepticism.
And the thing about it, those are some of the issues that lawyers run into, and when they're having to recreate what happened in a particular scene for a trial.
Eyewitness testimony is only so reliable.
And memory can be a real tricky thing.
Well, so while we're on the subject of new media partnerships, we've got another one for you. This one brought to you by the letters H, B, and O. Yes, I'm talking about the news that the Children's Television Workshop will premiere next season's episodes of Sesame Street on the premium cable network first, and then they're going to play in reruns on PBS 9 months later. Reaction to this has been mixed. There have been the jokes because of the dark and gritty nature of most of the HBO programming, like, whether Tony Soprano will be the boss, or maybe Ernie and Bert can get walk-on roles in the next season of True Detective, or the Count fitting right in on True Blood. Even Sesame Street producers have gotten into the act with this Game of Thrones mashup.
Westeros needs a new king or queen. And to decide, we will play a game. A game of chess. Huzzah! And here to tell you how to play the game is Grover Bluejoy. Grover Bluejoy? Where is Grover Bluejoy?
Sorry I'm late, but it was really hard getting over that wall out there.
Just tell everyone how to play the game.
Right. The game of chairs is played with a deck of cards.
Okay, so Mike, you're our Game of Thrones fan, but to be serious for a minute about what this all really means, for generations, Sesame Street has been a vehicle or a substitute for preschool education, for kindergarten readiness, for children in low-income families who may not have otherwise had the ability to get some of those early reading lessons. And that was the vehicle to do that. Now it's going to be behind a premium cable paywall.
For 9 months. And I have to say, I'm in the camp that says this is actually, when you take everything into consideration, better for people who rely on Sesame Street for that kind of educational component than what would be the alternative, which is basically because the business model for Sesame Street no longer works and nobody's stepping forward with tax dollars or anything else or contributions to save it. HBO stepping in and doing so. And by the way, letting the Sesame Workshop produce twice as many new episodes a year is pretty good. And frankly, I can see why you'd have these qualms about the equity of poor kids not getting able to see it for 9 months. But how many Sesame Street episodes are kids talking around the water cooler like, hey, did you see what was on that episode yesterday?
Well,
that's not what they're like.
Fair enough. This agreement, though, is also going to take the full Sesame Street archive that's currently on Amazon and Netflix out of the mix as well. Those are accessible for far less per month at about $7.99 a month versus the $15 or $20 you're paying HBO to get them.
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that the commitment on the part of we as a society in public television is pretty much nil right now. And now you see where Sesame Street is one of the most the long running show that I remember as a kid, and I would say my parents remember it premiering. That show was there. And now it's moving to HBO because we have that lack of commitment on the part of public television, by government, by society as a whole.
And public television is falling victim in so many ways to ratings competitions that we see at commercial radio stations, where we're finding too with documentary series that are falling the wayside in favor of some of these British dramas like Downton Abbey or Masterpiece that people are tuning into more, and they're trying to program that more.
I don't know that this is really a question about us, somehow focusing less attention or resources on public media, as it's this bigger question about these legacy networks having to deal with streaming and people wanting to look at individual episodes. I mean, frankly, I'm a big defender of public media. They belong in the mix. They do some kinds of programming and stories that nobody else is likely to do without that taxpayer or donation support. But I mean, come on, there's Noggin and there's Nickelodeon and there's Disney and there's all kinds of programs out there for kids. And frankly, Sesame Street, of all the programs that are on public media for kids, and there are a lot of kids shows on PBS, that's one that doesn't need public subsidies to survive. I mean, Sesame Street is going to do just fine, and kids will have access to it without figuring out whether or not we need more taxpayer support for it.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying there, and I'm happy that HBO was willing to step up and support this show and keep it running, because you're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, had they not done that, the show might have just died off. And, I don't think
there's more to lose without this HBO.
There's a lot more to lose, but I do think that when you start talking about the streaming part of it and the cost of that there is going to be a certain segment of society that's going to be left out of that because of the cost.
Now, it's interesting. I was talking about this topic with Mark Hinojosa, who's one of our new faculty members, and he said, what would be brilliant? It would be if HBO were to make Sesame Street available and take the paywall down online so that anybody could go to a browser or to an app and still access that program if it's about a public service.
I guess if, and I don't mean to be doctrinaire about this, but if HBO and Sesame Workshop did not have the provision for PBS to still get the episodes for free 9 months later, or if somehow Sesame Street was very topical and, somehow not seeing it for 9 months was going to disadvantage kids, okay, I'd say they ought to do something like that. But frankly, having it behind the paywall is a way that makes it work for both HBO and the Sesame Workshop so that we get more new episodes for kids to enjoy.
Well, I do like the fact that HBO is providing enough funding for them to do more than what they were doing under PBS. So I think that in and of itself is a really good thing.
Okay, well, I want to switch gears for a few minutes and talk about two stories that were in the New York Times this week that maybe didn't get as much attention as you might have thought that they would have. The first was a collaboration with Pro-Publica that revealed a pretty tight partnership between AT&T and the NSA. This came as part of that massive data dump that Edward Snowden had done initially 2 years ago. To know that there was some relationship with AT&T and the NSA, that wasn't so much a surprise as just how deep it went, that there were special jargon words listed in NSA and in AT&T glossaries, that AT&T really was most responsible for domestic online spying.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think anyone is surprised that AT&T and the other new telecommunications companies were involved in this. And I'm pretty sure that people aren't surprised at how deep it went, especially when you're getting the cooperation from these companies. As we've seen in all of these leaks, there was cooperation on the part of commercial telecommunications for NSA to be able to even operate and do the things that it was doing. And also the fact that it reached outside of U.S. shores. One of the ways people found out was that, the Japanese earthquake caused a disruption. So that's how they were able to figure out that AT&T was a company that had pretty much said, hey, come on in, NSA, take as much as you want. So people see that. I don't think they're really surprised anymore about it.
I don't think it's groundbreaking journalism, and I don't think it's going to change public policy in any perceptible way, but I still really like the series for a couple of reasons. One, it showed the strength of these collaborations between Pro-Publica and other media. So this time they had the New York Times, and they had documentarian Laura Poitras, who was involved in sort of the original leaks from Snowden. So, I mean, that is another example of how those partnerships can strengthen investigative reporting is really great. And the other thing I just would say about it is, if anybody thought that the Snowden treasure trove leak was somehow, we're getting to the end of the revelations coming from that, not yet.
See, and I'm still waiting for what is, and as I read the story, I'm wondering, is that the leak that was at the end of Citizen 4? Is that, no, there's still more coming.
Yeah, there's more.
That wasn't that one yet. The other story, it's one that got a bit more attention. It pulled the curtain back on business practices at Amazon. It was a pretty brutal account describing a competitive atmosphere where employees are encouraged to rip apart others' ideas in meetings, to give secret feedback to supervisors. Emails and text messages fly back and forth during overnight hours, demanding to know during those overnight hours why employees aren't responding immediately. Former White House Press Secretary Jay Carney now works for Amazon as its Senior Vice President for Corporate Global Affairs. He was on CBS this morning. He was really critical, discrediting the report, and he was defending his current employer.
This is an incredibly compelling place to work, a place where people are excited to come to work. And I think the fundamental flaw in the story is the suggestion that any company that had the kind of culture that the New York Times wrote about, and sort of a cruel Darwinian or Dickensian kind of atmosphere in the workplace, could survive and thrive in today's marketplace.
The guy was the president's press secretary. He is a spin meister, if we've ever seen or heard one. That was some spin.
I mean, gag me with that. And also with Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and his reply to it. I mean, it's true that, if they were the only ones who were behaving that way in their segment of the industry and tech segment generally, that they wouldn't survive. That's true. But there's a lot of other tech companies that do similar things. You never heard Bezos once, nor for Jay Carney for that matter, contradict any of the facts in the New York Times story. They only attacked what the significance of the story was. And I just think they're wrong. I mean, I think they did a great job at the New York Times of using lots and lots of interviews to be able to prove that workplace environment is different than what most people probably perceive it to be.
And I think what also strengthened the story along with those was not just the interviews, but they had interviews with former people who formerly worked there and people who currently work there. And that, I think, is what strengthened it. It wasn't this sort of thing where you have people who formerly worked there who had some axe to grind or something like that. You have people who are currently working there saying, yeah, I love what I'm doing, but it is taking a toll on me, and it's taking a toll on my family, and I'm having to decide, am I going to have a life or am I going to have a job? Because with Amazon, there's no either or.
Well, and this isn't the first time. We've talked about other investigative journalism that has taken a look, and that there has been undercover camera documentaries done by the BBC and some European outlets. We've talked about other stories that have been done that show what life is like in the fulfillment centers, where employees are walking 12 miles a day, where they have quotas of certain number of orders they have to fill. So if that's the environment on the blue collar side of the company, I don't know why it would come as any bit of a surprise that those same, drive hard, cutthroat, competitive techniques are going on the white collar side.
Nobody has to agree with the notion that why would you want to work there? There are plenty of hard charging people who admire Amazon and who think it would be worth putting in the time there because that company is doing some revolutionary things. And if you feel that way, good for you. And it is true that this kind of behavior goes on in both the blue collar world and the white collar world. Look at the series that the Times did recently about nail salons and how they had to defend that against what I thought was pretty lame criticism, just as I think Bezos' criticism is pretty lame. But look at some of the specific anecdotes that they came out with. It isn't just that, well, they're like every other, high-tech company. We had people saying, I had cancer, I had miscarriages, and all kinds of other problems, and I was forced out or severely criticized because I let that get in the way of my performance at Amazon. And that's pretty damning.
And I think part of the problem is that they were told one thing, but then when they came back to work, there was a totally different environment. They were put under this totally different set of rules. And that, I think, is where people sort of stopped and looked, because when you go and read the comments, you have people saying, whoa, wait a minute.
You read the comments?
Yeah, I read the comments.
Don't read the comments.
Yeah, don't read the comments. But in this case, I had to go read the comments because what I was trying to find out was how were people responding to this.
It.
And one of their responses was, whoa, wait a minute. It's okay if people go into that environment and they understand the rules, but then when you change the rules in the middle of the game, now you have a problem. One of the things I didn't see, which is really surprising to me, is I saw very few comments that talked about they need a union. They need a union and someone to step up, because that was one of the things that came out in the nail salon stories that the New York Times did was government intervention, and if they had a union, this wouldn't happen. I didn't see that in this, and I'm wondering, is it because of the kind of atmosphere or culture of tech environment?
I mean, high tech is, unions and high tech, those two do not mix. This whole libertarian philosophy of most technology companies, I don't think that you're going to see anybody seriously try to do that. I will say about the comments, though, that one of the things I did fault the Times for just a little bit, that one of the current employees, an engineer of Amazon, tried to rebut some of this with a post that he had originally written for LinkedIn, and then he wrote a little intro in the comments section to the New York Times and then tried to have that link posted, and the Times comments editors didn't let it go through because they said he didn't provide enough commentary on the Times website to justify linking away to LinkedIn. They probably just, out of an abundance of caution, should have allowed that post to go up.
Okay, well, this week we marked the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina's landfall on New Orleans, and there have been anniversary stories galore from the national media, the New Orleans local media, even local outlets in other markets. And for the most part, that coverage has done a phenomenal job of capturing the nuance and emotion so many are feeling right now. And then there was the column that appeared in the Chicago Tribune, my former employer. When it first went up online, it had the headline, quote, "In Chicago, wishing for Katrina." Yes, columnist Kristen McQuarrie penned a column in which she wished for a storm as epic as a Category 5 hurricane to give Chicago a chance to, quote, "hit the reset button and root out government corruption, out of control borrowing, and to reform a struggling school system." I first saw this Thursday. I read it, and Ernest, I could picture your head exploding with each further paragraph.
Well, I couldn't believe it. If anyone who, and there are a lot because this is the anniversary, who are commemorating, what happened, would never wish that on an American city. And for this columnist to use that as a way to talk about rooting out corruption, dealing with the dysfunctional government, changing a dysfunctional school system, to say, well, hey, if we just had a cataclysmic natural disaster, then we could sweep all of that under the rug and start over. Well, I can tell you, because the New York Times Magazine has done a story on this.
It's on our links blog.
It's on the links blog, where they talk about, here's what's happened in New Orleans since then. 180,000 people did not return to New Orleans. And of those who did, you have a big distinction between the haves and the have-nots, people who have yet to recover 10 years later with Katrina, and those who have come in and basically used that as a way to turn the city to their benefit at the expense of others. So, she just didn't do her homework. And I think if she had, she probably would have gone in another direction. I hope she would have gone in another direction.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything that Ernest said. And I think there were two big problems with that column. I think the bigger one is not the one that everybody's focusing on. The headline about, that was dumb, tone deaf, whatever, description you want to use. I think the bigger problem is what Ernest is talking about here at the end, this sort of oversimplifying the lessons from Katrina. One of the great responses to this was from the editorial board at the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and they basically said it's a whole lot more complex than all of this. Yeah, government has been reformed. Yes, there have been some improvements in the city, but there's a heck of a lot of neighborhoods that are still ghost towns. There's a lot of people who still haven't reaped the benefits of all these reforms in city government. So that's something that we need to keep our eye on. I will say, though, that I think that some of the people who criticized McCrary for what she said are being disingenuous in their criticism. The people who went through Katrina, their outrage is real and justified, but I think there are some people who are criticizing this who are over the top with their own agendas. Okay. And I'm happy to say more about that.
If you'd like to, go ahead.
Well, first of all, you had on our links blog, you had a post where somebody's headline was "Most Evil Op-Ed Ever." Okay, well, I think that was manufactured because
That's clickbait.
It was not only was it clickbait, but it was also someone trying to defend Rahm Emanuel, Democratic politics in Chicago, defending public unions, all things that were being attacked by McCurry in her column. And I think that was just disingenuous to do that. There was also a piece that you posted on our Links blog from the Chicago chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. And they were saying basically, we want a meeting because this speaks to the glaring lack of a strong African-American presence at the newspaper. Fair criticism? Yes. Using this as an example of it is just another way that people are trying to talk past each other and use these terrible clickbait kinds of headlines and arguments instead of getting into a real debate about the issues.
I do have some other issues, though, with how some of this process was carried out over time. Is some of that criticism was coming out from reaction from people in New Orleans and elsewhere, the headline changing without transparency, the addition of a sentence that said that was attempting to clarify and saying that it was a metaphorical storm, not an actual storm that she was wishing and praying
Katrina
for.
was an actual storm.
Well,
really.
right. But she wasn't looking for an actual storm.
No, she was in the original.
In the
She was
original,
in the
but a
original
sentence
version,
with
yes,
an
yes,
attempt
yes.
to soften and couch it without any transparency that these sentences were being added or what the editorial process was, or that maybe there weren't any editors along the way that raised their hand and had a problem.
But see,
with
that's
this.
that's the problem I see, and I think this is maybe what the Chicago NABJ chapter was trying to get at, is that there should have been someone, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, an editor or a person of color, but there should have been someone who raised their hand and say, wait a minute,
It doesn't have to be a person of color to read this and say this really shouldn't be published under our masthead.
Exactly.
And even if you think that maybe there was some justification in the points being raised in the article, the apology, how can anybody defend that? It was just one more example of something we talk about every time on this show. It wasn't an apology.
It was an explanation.
It was saying, I'm sorry that you interpreted what I said a certain way.
Yeah,
No,
instead of saying, no, you were wrong.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And I do hope that we still see Katrina is still very raw in people's minds and people's hearts, and that we do see more of that nuanced coverage over the course of the next few days. Have there been other things, Ernest, that you've seen in addition to that New York Times piece that stuck with you?
Well, I mean, that along with I've seen some other pieces. I think that what you're going to see over the course of the next week or so as we move toward the 29th is people really taking a look at what's happening in New Orleans and going and finding some of those families who did not return to New Orleans. There are a lot in Houston, there are a lot in Baton Rouge, there's some all over the country, and talk to them about why they didn't return and what has that meant to them in their lives. But then also go to those who did return and say, how is this different? How is New Orleans different? It'd be interesting to see what the Times-Picayune does, because they've they've changed completely.
And in fact, there was a
period.
report this week that they could be looking at another 100 job cuts there too, in the midst of all of this.
Yeah.
I know one piece I heard that I really enjoyed was a piece that was on NPR either this past weekend or the one before, looking at children of different ages and how it's affected them and how they've attempted to move forward. That music means we're pretty much out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about all of the topics that we talked about today on our Links blog. That's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. We also encourage you to like us on Facebook or to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, to send us questions, comments, see what we'll be talking about next week and more. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for directing our show today and KBIA's Pat Akers for handling the audio for us. I'm Amy Simons. Thanks for joining us. We'll be with you again next week for another edition of Views of the News.